Digi.City was the platform that I founded. It was a blog at the time, talking about what I was learning in real time. Back in 2016, the idea of a smart city was relatively new in the US, even though in places like China and across Europe, they're easily 10 years ahead of us. So through all this exploration, I have the opportunity to literally run around the world talking to communities about what they need to do on the policy side and the innovation side in order to become smarter communities. And yes, that is absolutely about the technology, the alphabet soup of things like 5G, IoT, AI, and of course blockchain. But it's also about the people part of it. How do we leverage technology to build greater communities, which build better worlds for all of us, both those on the have side and those on the don't have yet side. It's what I'm dedicating my life to, and it is what I'm dedicating today to. So thank you to Eisenhower Fellowships, to the World Tokenomic Forum, to Impact Hub Austin, to Smart Cities Connect, and of course to all of our guests. So speaking of guests, it is is the sound okay, or it's good? Okay, great. It is my absolute pleasure to have a very special guest with us here today, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. And we're going to have a fireside chat. There actually is a fireplace here, so that is very, very intentional. We're going to talk about where the U.S. is relative to smart cities and how 5G is going to play a part in that very important transition. So please join me in welcoming FCC Commissioner Carr. So one of the things that I was very impressed with is, things are happening in Washington that may seem, thank you, out of our purview and out of our control. And so it's very, very important that we create things like South by Southwest, which give reasons for important, busy people like the commissioner to come down here and tell us what's happening in Washington, what's not happening in Washington, and create a better kind of understanding about what the reality is. What I think is very interesting about your background, Commissioner, is that he's been a staffer of FCC for many years before being appointed as Commissioner in 2017. So you can certainly talk about your background better than I can, but again, just thank you for joining us and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks. It's really terrific to be here at South by Southwest. Really having a great time, learning a tremendous amount. This city, this state, has such a rich history of innovation, of entrepreneurship. It's really beneficial for us to get out of DC, to meet with you all, to hear what are the issues you have, whether it's regulatory, access to capital, whatever it is, and see how we can go back to DC and make your lives easier, because you're the ones that are out here creating value, creating new applications, and so it's great to get to spend some time with you all.
Great. So let's talk about 5G. Raise your hand if you know what 5G is. Okay, good. So pretty educated audience. Normally we spend a lot of time defining and talking about the what is it around 5G, but perhaps we can just do a high level, and these smart people seem like they're already kind of tuned in.
So as you all know, right now we have 4G wireless service, LTE, pretty good service, pretty high speed. 5G is the next generation of that. It's going to be 10 times faster, 5 times more responsive, but it's not just going to be about making your smartphone work faster. It is going to enable an entirely new generation of innovation. And we talk about things that you see now with autonomous cars, virtual reality, the massive Internet of Things, telehealth applications like remote surgery that requires really latency-sensitive applications and uses. The 5G networks is what's going to help get all that stuff across the finish line. The 4G networks aren't fast enough, don't have the latency, the lag to support those really new, interesting innovations that are coming around the corner.
So talking about 5G versus 4G, what is the difference? What's the there around these two different technologies?
So the network is going to look very different than today's wireless network. Right now, you're probably familiar, by and large, we have these large 100-foot, 200-foot macro cell that we call deployments. They cover wide geographic areas. 5G increasingly, up to 80% of the cell sites are going to be what we call small cells. So they're going to be the size of a pizza box, the size of a backpack, and there's going to be many, many more of them. Right now we have about 300,000 cell sites in the country. We need 10 to 100 times that many, but they're going to be predominantly small cells to support 5G because you need massive capacity. So one site, serving all these consumers isn't going to be enough for 5G. The other piece of it is we're using higher band spectrum. Up until now, we've used spectrum to get technical, essentially below 6 gigahertz. 5G, with some technological advancements, we're going to use spectrum all the way up to 100 gigahertz. So again, that's why we need these smaller cells, more densely packed in there, and that raises a host of interesting regulatory issues as well.
Yeah, sure. What are some of those regulatory issues, and maybe it's vastly different from previous fiber deployments?
Yeah, so right now, all of our federal, state, and local review processes, when you go to hang an antenna up there, assume that you're building another 100-foot, 200-foot tall macro site. The economics, whether it's the federal permitting costs, the environmental reviews, the historic reviews, are too expensive when you look at the economics of a small cell. You can't distribute the costs across these wide geographic areas. You're having, again, 10 to 100 times the number. So right now, one thing that's going to hold us back potentially from winning this race to 5G or getting it to more communities is our regulatory structure, our infrastructure rules, which again are geared to this big tower. So we're working a lot at the FCC, and how do we cut the regulatory costs? How do we modernize our approach so that it makes sense for these small cells, and not just for these big towers?
Yeah. So we're talking a lot today around kind of the innovation that's driving the future of cities. So we're talking about blockchain, we're talking about AI, we're talking about IoT, the alphabet soup of all these numbers and letters. What is the role of 5G in that myriad of things?
This goes back to where we started. I mean, 5G is going to be the network platform that's going to enable IoT, that's going to enable smart cities. Right now, our network infrastructure isn't where it needs to be given these interesting new use cases. So if we want to realize smart cities, if we want to realize sort of this massive IoT, we need to get the network to move forward.
I was just in Oakland at the American Association of Port Authorities, so everybody be real jealous you didn't get to go to that conference.
Exactly.
But honestly, I mean, it was really fascinating, and industrial IoT was absolutely at the top of everyone's mind. And what I was actually kind of surprised about is that the industrial IoT and the Internet of Things technology is there, but a lot of the ports aren't using it to its fullest capacity because the network simply isn't available.
Right.
They're very excited about 5G because that lower latency and just the power that all of that provides. So it's a very real example.
Yeah, absolutely. We see a lot of these industrial IoT applications, from drones to remote monitoring to remote control, that right now either can't be done or can't be done in an economically efficient way. But when we move the network towards this next generation, we'll be there.
So where is the U.S. relative to the rest of the world, and what is the role of the FCC in helping us move forward?
Yeah. We're in decent shape right now. So if you look back at the prior generations of wireless service, go back before 4G was 3G, the U.S. didn't lead the world in 3G. Europe really led the way in a lot of respects. The U.S. learned some lessons, and we actually have led the world in the deployment of 4G. We've had much more 4G LTE subscriptions and uptake in the U.S. than they have in Europe or other parts of the world. Countries around the world are very cognizant of that. They're very cognizant of the fact that they lost the race to 4G to the U.S. There is a broad consensus and commitment around the world that no country wants to lose the race to 5G. So Europe has a big 2020 action plan. A lot of countries in Asia, obviously, are very active in this space as well. They all want to win the race to 5G. And it's not just about, who's first for bragging rights. It makes a difference because for 5G in the US, for instance, we need $275 billion invested in the networks to get this transition. And capital's smart. It's going to flow to those countries first that are leading the way in 5G. And I think the country that's going to lead in 5G is the one that reforms its regulatory structures most quickly to support this massive new deployment that we need. And that's where federal policy comes into play. Part of it is spectrum. We're opening up big new spectrum bands to enable this innovation. But a big piece of it is infrastructure. Like I said, we need to get a lot more of these relatively small cell sites deployed. And right now, our regulatory structures are holding us back. At the federal level, we have historic and environmental review procedures, which have made sense for these big deployments and the big impact they have on the ground. But it's millions of dollars. So one provider, Sprint, has spent $23 million on complying with federal historic and environmental review for its deployments. And the record shows that virtually none of those deployments, virtually none of that money, was actually going in a way that would have altered the deployment or caught a disturbance. It's 0.3% of deployments across the industry that have gone through this federal historic and environmental review process that's either been changed where the deployment is or otherwise found anything. AT&T next year is expected to spend $45 billion on these federal environmental historic reviews. That's, I'm sorry, $45 million. That's millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that's going into regulatory red tape that, yes, in theory is serving a good purpose. We want to protect historical sites, we want to protect environmental sites, but that's hundreds of millions for 0.3% of sites that have an impact. So what we want to do, what carriers have said, is we can streamline that federal regulatory review that frees up directly hundreds of millions of dollars that can then be used to deploy more antenna sites. And then earlier this week, I took a road trip through the Shenandoah Valley, which is back in my home state of Virginia, a very rural area. I met with a small provider, Shentel. And they said that by streamlining this federal environmental historic review, they'll be able to put the capital into 13 new sites in the valley. And it may not seem like a lot to us because we need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sites, but it can make a big difference in terms of getting that very first high-speed wireless broadband to a community, or introducing the first competitive choice that a community might have. And so I understand these aren't necessarily black and white issues in terms of the important purposes that these federal reviews are serving. But to me, when we look at where we need to go, when we look at wanting to get more competition, better, faster broadband, this is a ripe area where we can reorient that capital towards actual deployment.
And what's the role for cities and states relative to the federal government? I mean, I think it's really refreshing that you're setting the tone from the top and saying, how can we enable the local level communities to get better, more, faster?
The state and local side is critically important. So even though we were reforming these federal processes, that doesn't greenlight any particular deployment. You still need to go to each city, each locality, and get zoning approval or building permit approvals to actually put these facilities up there. Some states, some communities are extremely forward-thinking. They realize if we get this new infrastructure, we will become a smart city. That'll save us money. It'll make it attractive for residents, for businesses. Others aren't as forward-thinking, and they continue to impose barriers so that it costs too much. And again, capital is smart. You know, if you're a city and it costs too much or it takes too long to hang this new next-gen broadband infrastructure, then the money's going to go to another community, and you're going to miss out. It's hard to sort of have that discussion with a lot of state and local governments, but it's a mixed bag. Some are very forward-thinking and doing it right. Some are falling behind. At the FCC, we do have some authority to step in and help make sure that there's some guide rail so that the processes aren't taking too long. But state and local is very important partners in this.
Yeah, and the work with Digi.City is really, for me personally, is to identify the cities who are doing really well and the states who are moving forward very quickly. I mean, early on, I just said, well, I can either celebrate the champions or just get really frustrated on the sidelines. So I decided to celebrate the champions, and it's really inspiring. And we're starting to see some of the communities that are announcing that 5G will be going to those locations. So I think good old American competition will start to kick in.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So you brought up your visit to Virginia, and brings up a sensitive topic around the digital divide. I mean, in Austin, one of the things that characterizes our community here is, yes, it's very entrepreneurial, but it's very focused on social impact, and it's caring, not just about the folks who have means, but the folks who are really trying to get there. So can you talk a little bit about FCC, perhaps 5G, and what impact that'll have to bridge the digital divide and create a path to prosperity?
So I think this is a situation where two things are sort of simultaneously true. We are leading the world in 4G deployment. We're doing really well on a number of metrics in terms of deployment and connecting people. At the same time, there are still far, far too many communities, far too many Americans that lack access to high-speed internet, that lack access to any broadband. That's a problem. It's a problem in terms of access to healthcare information, in terms of jobs. So many job applications are online. If you want to start a business, if you have a high-speed broadband connection on a laptop, you can do it. If you don't, you're sort of shut out. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that everyone, regardless of where they live, regardless of their economic circumstances, has access to high-speed broadband. And we're doing a couple things at the Commission to do that.